Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom. Today we're talking about DORA in the European Union. It's part of the changes we've made this season to talk about more than just FedRAMP. But before we get to that, we have some beers. What are we drinking today, Tom?
Well, I think calling this a beer is a little bit probably disingenuous. This is actually a cider. We are breaking new ground here on Drafting Compliance. So this is Excelsior Imperial Apple. It's from the Schilling Cider House. Kayne, you'll be thrilled to know that this is 8.4% ABV. So,
my goodness, and I have family coming in for the holidays, so this
it's
sounds
almost
like
noon
a good
my
way
time.
to start
So
my day.
lunch is going to be extra special today. But
and Tom, before we pull it, I have to point out we have brand new Drafting Compliance.
Isn't that cool? I don't know if
I think that's coming through on there.
Yeah.
I hope that's coming through on there. We have brand new Drafting Compliance beer glasses.
They spoil
I personally think we should have a merch store, but that's still to be determined. But in the meantime, we've got some pretty cool stuff. I think we can hopefully give these to guests when they're on the show. I think
that'd be cool. Fun the can is pretty cool. It's got a giraffe in a NASA helmet.
Yeah, so. It's definitely something. Giraffe.
It's got like a
giraffe cider.
Yeah.
Heirloom hard cider.
I'm cracking
cider.
it.
All right, we'll open it up and see it. Okay.
Definitely cracks different. There's no bubbles. Oh, it smells like boozy apples.
Yeah, it smells like apple juice. Looks like apple juice. Probably is apple juice. Oh, but hey, you know what? This is actually the perfect size glass. Look at that. You can 100% fit a beer in this glass if it's in a 12-ounce can.
It's got a little head on it. It's pretty It's pretty clear. Clarity is through it. I can see my fingers on the other side. It's effervescent bubbly. So
yeah, it is quite a lot of little bubbles in there. Not quite as bubbly as champagne.
It's no mistaking that this is apple.
Oh yeah, that's definitely apple.
It's boozy apple. That's the best way I can describe it.
Boozy apple. All right, well that's the nose is boozy apple.
I'm going in. Let's give it a go.
We'll have it and see what it's like.
It tastes like boozy apple.
Oh.
I mean, it's tart. It's tart.
It's
like
sour.
Apple. Yep.
Oh.
You say sour. I would call that tart. It's like a dry sour.
It's very dry. You're very charitable calling it dry. I'm going to try it again just to make sure that wasn't a one-off. But how do people?
It's a little sweet. I've had quite a few ciders. This one, the alcohol overpowers the cider quite a bit.
Yeah, but I want something in this class of drink. I think I'd probably pick something else. Anything else? Oh goodness! I think wine is at least 8.4%. That is just. Ugh. Thank you to our production team for always keeping it interesting around here. We do appreciate you sending these. Excelsior, Schilling Cider House. Damn. Okay, well, we will definitely review that at the end of the show. I see it's the sink is in its future, I'm pretty sure. But today we're talking about DORA. So just to kick us off, Tom, at the very top, what is DORA?
Yeah, DORA stands for the Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA. It's an EU regulation. It's an EU regulation that is in purpose targeted towards financial sector in the EU, but in practice is certainly much more far-reaching than just the financial sector. So
yeah, let's talk about that because it's an EU regulation. We've heard about it a lot. I know I've written about it quite a lot on my LinkedIn. Tom, does DORA affect U.S.-based businesses?
It does. In the parlance of DORA, there's a concept of ICT. It's communications and internet.
Communications and telecommunications.
Yeah, something like that. It's technology companies that do work with the financial sector. That's the easiest way to think about ICTs. So the short answer is yes, this impacts U.S. companies because we are ICTs to organizations in the EU. So it has some cross-jurisdictional outreach. Mm-hmm. So it crosses outside of the EU. So
your nickel word for that one, Tom, is extraterritorial.
Yeah. Extraterritorial, cross jurisdiction, whatever you want to call it. It's essentially a reach outside of where the home base for that regulation is.
But that's only if it's a U.S. based provider, if they work with EU based financial entities, right?
Well, if you work with organizations that work with, so it's a lot like FedRAMP in this sense, right? If you do work with organizations that do work with financial institutions, you're probably going to feel the sting of DORA as well.
Okay, so it's throughout the entire supply chain. It's not just where you have to be directly servicing an EU-based financial provider. You have to be ICT to either direct or via. You're right. It is like CMMC or it is like FedRAMP, where this sounds like contract flowdowns, Tom.
There is much in the way of contract flowdown in this legislation. That is correct.
Okay. And I think there's a couple of designations. Aren't there ICT providers as well as critical ICT providers in this one?
Yeah, and honestly, that's a source of confusion for folks, is to try to understand who gets to define who's critical and who gets to define themselves as critical, and can I define myself as not critical? This is these are things that in any new regulation there is imperfections in the way it's written, and I'd say this is an area where there's imperfections. We're going to see further clarity with time in this area, but yeah, the institution you're working with may deem you as critical, and if they do deem you as critical, you will have further obligations under DORA.
Yeah, and you also have potentially direct oversight under DORA, as well as those additional compliance obligations.
That's correct.
So something that we've talked about before, Tom, it's an EU reg. They certainly do not, they don't roll these out quietly. There's just not some hidden place that they post these. They make a lot of noise when they make these. So I've got to ask, why are US-based businesses so confused about DORA?
Yeah, I would say with how loud they are, they also aren't super forthcoming about how broad-reaching the regulations are actually going to be. So I think that was the case with DORA. I think everybody looked at it and said, oh, DORA, financial. I'm not financial, so I don't need to worry about it, right? And they didn't understand sort of the outreach that legislation has outside of financial as well. So there's that sort of familiarity piece of it that on the surface we thought we were familiar with it, and in applicability we were not. So,
I think part of it, the other part of it is on timing. Is DORA was coming out about the same time, and it looked to overlap with regulations like the EU NIS2 directive, and I think that also added some complexity and also some confusion, because if you're a financial service, like if you're in a financial services provider's supply chain, which one is applicable, I think, is something that companies really did end up struggling with.
100%, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit more. But we see that there's tremendous overlap between NIS2 and with DORA. So folks are trying to kind of feel their way through what legislation do I actually have to comply with. In many cases, the answer is both. I think folks are also struggling with what are the definitions of certain elements within the legislation, and that's creating companies sort of a stance where they're treading water, waiting for those definitions to become clearer before they try to comply. So people are later to the party because of that. And then
I think a good example of that is resilience testing under DORA, which I think is not a common term that many would have bumped into. And we should definitely talk about that later in the show.
Well, it's right in the name, right? So I think when we think of resilience testing in the United States, people jump right to like things like business continuity testing, right? And it's much bigger than that. In general, I would say there's a gap between the definitions in the language we're used to in the United States and the definitions in the language that are pushed out with DORA in the EU. So there's that gap to cover. And then there's also a bunch of U.S. regulations that I think folks sort of think, well, we should have some reciprocity with the EU around it. The reality is you have to prove your compliance with DORA as of right now. There is no recognized reciprocity as of right now. So.
Yeah, and let's get into that, because we've been sort of talking about DORA, at least at a high level. What are the key compliance requirements that are under DORA?
Yeah, there's quite a few. Probably I can break them down to some broad categories. Risk management is a big one. So do you have a risk management process? Do you consider all of your risks to resiliency in that? Do you consider your vendors from a risk perspective? Is risk ownership at the appropriate level in your organization? So senior management.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also something in there around regular risk assessments too in that risk management, right?
Absolutely. That's part of the framework. And in most, honestly, if you adopt any, I would say, industry accepted risk framework, you're probably going to meet this, with the exception of maybe the very defined, your senior management is responsible piece of it.
Right.
Incident reporting is a big piece of DORA. So, what's interesting about it is, as big a part of DORA as it is, it's also not well defined. So I think like the timeline for incident notification is without undue delay. So you tell me what that means. So what's happening is you're seeing organizations define that differently. And so you might be inclined to say, well, let's go look at something else like NIST 2. And NIST 2 still has a wide range, right? It's 24 to 72 hours. So we don't have the definitive sort of language we'd like to see underneath there. Again, another piece of this is the resiliency testing. So sort of the language here is, are you testing your application or your delivery of service against adverse conditions? So again, define what adverse conditions are. There's a piece of this where you may have to, depending on if you're critical or not, you may have to have threat-led pen testing occur in your environment. So that's a big ask of organizations, and it's an expense that folks may not yet be thinking they have to incur.
Well, also, and depending on their level of maturity, they might not be able to process the outcomes of that. I've worked with companies that have had their first red team, and it's usually a very bad time for them if they are low maturity. And so I think there's an assumption there, made possibly incorrectly by the EU authors of DORA, that those recipients who are in that critical designation of ICT are going to be able to process this. And if I think, as we said earlier, Tom, if somebody gets designated as critical who's of a lower maturity, it's certainly going to expose some challenges there, whether that's in the contract for, as you said, the threat-led pen testing, or as I think of it as just red teaming, like that, just defining how that works could be challenging for those organizations.
100%. And you said some words there I think are important. Is when DORA talks about threat-led testing, they're not talking about a pen test.
It's not just
talking
fire
about
up
a red
burp
team
suite
exercise.
And, get the initial output. That's
right. Other things that fall underneath DORA are, there's contractual requirements to third parties that you have to follow. There's what I would say pretty well defined best practices around security controls. So if you're following another framework, those are the easy ones to hit. But if you're not, those are going to give you a bad time too. Do you have a disaster recovery plan? Do you have a business continuity plan? Do you have vulnerability management? Those are sort of the basics of information security, but they're called out in DORA again. So those are the highlights. Certainly, as you dig into those.
I think there's one more as I think about this one, Tom, and it's on information sharing. And that was a kind of an unexpected one for me, because under DORA, my understanding is that ICT providers have to share information on threats as well as vulnerabilities. And there's this idea of collective resilience. And I think that anybody who's tried to work with the federal government in the United States, who's gone and hung out in a skiff to talk to somebody in a nice blue suit, has often found the information exchange feels one way. Like you'll go into the secure container information. Don't ever go into a skiff unless you have to. And you'll have a conversation with somebody. You'll say, we're seeing these TTPs. We're seeing these vulnerabilities. You want to share this information with the government. And then maybe 6 months later, if you're lucky, they'll give you an acknowledgement, historically speaking. And I think that's been a challenge. So I think that culturally, the idea of threat sharing, at least domestically in the United States, DORA is going to feel fairly unfamiliar, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to be honest with you, there's even cause to say there's conflict with U.S. regulation around this, right? Because in something like FedRAMP, where you have CUI defining broadly security documentation and infrastructure documentation, you can't be too forthcoming with what what is targeting specific areas of your own infrastructure, right? That would fall underneath CUI rules. So I agree with you. We have territory here that we do not know yet how to traverse.
Yeah. And speaking of that, if you're enjoying this conversation on YouTube, ring the bell to get notifications about my quest to find any beer that's drinkable. I guess now that includes cider, or subscribe to this in your podcast app of choice to make this part of your routine.
I'm
Tom,
hoping this is, I'll be honest with you, Ken, I'm hoping we don't have too many more ciders.
The production team is listening, I'm sure, and they're thinking, we should send them
ciders.
However, I notice you, like I, have not drank very much of this.
I've been sipping it. Certainly not as aggressively as I typically do, but
yeah, you didn't say this one. What do you say? Coats the tongue and suckers you in for another, I think is how you say it.
Something similar
that has
to
not come up today. Yeah. All right. Well, we were talking about DORA and we were talking about differences. So how does this compare with some existing U.S. cybersecurity regulations, Tom?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would probably start by saying there's ways that it doesn't compare real well. First is, we're I would say increasingly seeing EU regulation reach past its own borders. That's not typical of U.S. regulation. So that's a difference. And I think that's going to feel unfamiliar to us. And so we have to get used to that idea, right? Certainly GDPR should have set us up for it, but DORA's taken it another step further. But if you look at frameworks within the United States that we are familiar with, a lot of the controls are going to line up really close, right? FSMA, NIST, FedRAMP, you're going to see a lot of similar controls. You're just going to have more specificity where we had optionality in those in the United States. So, for instance, the incident response is going to not be open for definition. The federal or the DORA regulations, EU regulations, are going to try to define that tighter. And I think we'll wait to see how it gets audited in the future to know exactly what that means. But I'm not scared of DORA in terms of the practical application in the world of controls. I don't think that's too difficult. I'm more fearful in the audit side if it comes to pass of DORA and how it gets interpreted, because there's some gaps in how it's defined.
Yeah, I do agree with you on that one. But on just the extraterritoriality thing, I think that it is a narrower band. Like DORA is specifically targeting the financial sector and its ICT providers where, their primes or subs or in the supply chain. But if you look at something like in the United States, like GLBA, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, or you look at what CISA is doing, those have got a much broader application across various sectors. So GLBA has recently been expanded to include a lot more providers than just your traditional financial things. Yeah. And I do agree, DORA's, again, it has some similarities. I see that there's this focus on operational resilience and on risk management, whereas in the United States, I think we mostly focus on data protection and information sharing rather than necessarily resiliency. Right, Tom?
I think that's true, except for we saw with Rev 5 and NIST and FedRAMP both. We have the requirement now for red team. So this is becoming more common, I think, across frameworks, and I think we'll see it become sort of standard language. It's just the term resiliency testing that feels weird to me. But when I try to define it in sort of in the space of how I think of it, I do think these are things that we're starting to see in other frameworks. It's not super common yet.
Yeah, and I think that's NIST getting ahead of it, because you're right. NIST is a framework at a regulatory level domestically in the United States. Off the top of my head, I don't think anybody's got resiliency testing. So NIST was front running that with Rev 5 of 800-171, I guess that would have been. And they, when organizations have to deal with that, maybe NIST Rev 5 actually would be a good way of looking at advancing that agenda under DORA.
Yeah, I think that's right. And certainly, FedRAMP is a reflection of NIST. So FedRAMP Rev 5 is a federal regulation now. We deal with that now in FedRAMP too. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think DORA, in some ways, I was reading an article about U.S.-based breach notification laws for various U.S. states, because goodness knows we can't have a consolidated one.
Right.
And I think in some ways that should be familiar to organizations, at least in that DORA has defined timelines. Sometimes they're a little squishy about ICT incidents, but we're already accustomed to having to do multiple disclosures with multiple varying timelines depending on industry or depending on region that you're at.
That's exactly right, Kayne. I mean, even if you're not following a framework, if you're getting questionnaires as part of your job, everybody's asking about what your breach notification timeline is, right? So, and they're pushing back. Quite frankly, they're pushing back on things that were acceptable 3 years ago. So these timelines are getting tighter and tighter, and I honestly think that's why DORA chose to be sort of ethereal about their definition, because I think they don't know what is the right timeline yet either. So they just want to make sure that you're not unduly delaying it.
Right. Well, if those are the things that are kind of similar with DORA and the United States existing regulations, are there any unique challenges that DORA poses compared to existing U.S. cybersecurity regulations?
I mean, what I call them challenges. I mean, again, it's kind of common ground here that we've already covered. You're going to see the EU reaching across borders, and that's a challenge for companies that's not particularly used to that. Certainly, the oversight of an EU authority on the business that you're trying to do in the EU is different. We're not used to that. We don't have generally foreign governments overseeing our businesses, so that's different. And if you're a critical ICT, that is going to happen if you want to do business with financial institutions in the EU. So be prepared for that. That's a big challenge. I think the lack of definition is a challenge. Certainly, when I see things, I think it's laughable when you see things like unduly delayed, because it's just not clear what that means. I think when you see quotes around critical, which you see in the legislation, that should make you laugh too, because we want to see a defined critical, and we want to be able to.
I want to go back to something you said at the top, though, Tom, on DORA. I don't think that they're like it's all laughable. Like some of this, the red teaming or threat-led penetration testing, I think that's going to be very challenging for a lot of organizations.
100%.
So even though some of this is
laughable,
squishy,
I don't mean laughable in terms of like this isn't real legislation. Or it's not hard to. It's companies that are taking an honest approach to try to comply with it, but not getting clarity on what it means. That's the part that's difficult. I agree. Okay. The red team piece of this, most organizations don't understand what that looks like, and they will probably reach out to their normal pen test company that they've done work with the last 3 times and say
that they have a contract with for 3 years, because that's always a terrible idea.
So just on this pen test, just do a threat-led one too. I mean, and so, kind of understanding those definitions and what those things mean, I think is problematic. And then, hey, what you're going to be asked to do in your sort of nth party due diligence for your contractors or your sub-processors or however you want to call it, that's going to create a burden that you're not prepared to have. So, the reach of oversight that you're expected to have with these, not only your contractors, but the contractors of your contractors. That's right. A challenge.
Yeah, and I also think that there are daily fines in DORA. Like at the end of the day, if you are found to be not in compliance, if you're non-compliant, they can impose daily fines until you are compliant, which I think is like in the United States, typically we see a single action that you receive a penalty, and it is a cumulative penalty. There's no idea. I think the last time that I saw something like that was when PCI first came out back in the day, back when dinosaurs roamed the internet, where you'd see daily fines and an escalation process with PCI, but we've moved past that. I see in DORA they're going right back to that to try and drive and motivate change.
Yeah, I look at the release of DORA as similar to lots of legislative releases, whether it be in the EU or the United States. In the EU, GDPR would be similar. Again, in the United States, I think PCI is a good example, but there's this continuum that you might be able to look at and say, this is what it means to be compliant with this piece of legislation, right? And at one end is a severe overreach, and on the other end is this super lax approach, right? We want to be someplace in the middle. Right now, everybody is assuming this far reach side, and they're over rotating, in my opinion. I think we'll see a movement towards the middle over time, but it takes time. It takes clarity from audit to get to what are the most important items that we worry about, what are the definitions that we want to apply to these items that are currently not defined. When we get to that point, we'll start to see a movement back to reasonable approaches. But right now, everybody's just sort of trying to figure out, what does this mean? I think I've gone with a couple of our customers now. I think I've gone back and forth on DORA addendums for 2.5 months.
Oof.
To try to get clarity on definitions, but also get clarity on what are the real responsibilities under DORA.
And that's really, when you're talking about those contractual negotiations, that's typically for managing first-party risk. But DORA also, if I remember right, has got some third-party things in there. So does DORA affect third-party risk management?
100% it does. You've got to get kind of wrapped around the idea that DORA is going to, if you're doing work in the EU with financial institutions, or work with other organizations doing work with the financial institution, you're going to have to get around the idea that third-party risk management is going to be transformed likely. It imposes sort of a rigorous oversight. That oversight is contractual. It pushes, basically the language is, it pushes the similar or equivalent oversight that DORA has to your first party, to your third party. So it's not an easy lift, in my opinion, and it creates a, like, how does that end? Like, you're potentially gonna have multiple customers hitting you that are even a step away from who you're actually doing business with. So, that becomes problematic. I don't sort of like feel bad about the idea that we're supposed to be more diligent around third party. It's just the level of oversight that DORA brings to a body of people that aren't directly related to the business. That's problematic.
Yeah, and it really is. I agree with you. It's like, we will get better. Everyone collectively is going to get better who's in this space at third-party risk, because really DORA is mandating pre-contract due diligence. Something that we've seen, and something cybersecurity experts have often said, is like, do a risk assessment of your chief or your key or your important or your critical vendors. I think DORA is really actualizing that. But also, Tom, as you were saying there, I was thinking there are bits in there around preventing conflicts of interest between your ICT providers, so that's actually part of pre-contract diligence, which, again, for a lot of organizations that are of a lower maturity, I think that's going to really change the way that they're approaching vendor selection. And I think ultimately they might have to make policy changes internally about how they're making determinations for outsourcing
100%.
or for leveraging critical functions.
There's also language, Kayne, that says specifically you should do a risk assessment to make sure that there's not too much dependency across industry on single providers. So
yeah, and that's going to be a really interesting one to see how that plays out.
I mean, how does that play out for an Azure?
My read on these tea leaves, if you look at it, I'm going to bring in a couple here. If you look at the EU's AI Code of Practice, which has requirements for both providers as well as consumers of artificial intelligence. If you look at the EU's DORA, which we're talking about today, if you look at the EU's Product Liability Directive, which their update will say software bugs are liabilities for companies, and you can be taken to court for a software bug that you have to prove was undetectable at the time of release. I don't know a lot of vendors who can manage that effectively. That's kind of hard. And also that affects artificial intelligence, which means if you're an AI provider, a consumer of an AI-based service in the EU, if they feel that they have been harmed, they actually have got a lower standard of evidence to meet to prove that harm. So I think that DORA's idea of saying, hey, we want to distribute our risk through multiple ICT providers so we don't get a consolidation, while that's all very motherhead and apple pie, I don't think that's going to be what they get. I think we're going to end up seeing a consolidation of providers in this space, because ultimately the number of vendors that are going to be willing to enter, serve, and deal with the increased risks of this market are going to probably be either established players with deep pockets that can,
meet the regulation.
they can money their way through it, whether they're fined, or alternatively have already got a fairly high level of maturity. So to me, this almost feels like either it's a bit like pulling the ladder up behind some companies, wouldn't you say, Tom?
Yeah, 100%.
I think it's going to be harder to compete.
Yeah, I think there is some unintended consequences in the economies of the ICT world that maybe the EU didn't understand or intentionally ignored in making this legislation. But again, I think we will see this fall out someplace in the middle of that continuum I talked about, and we will see probably some changes to the legislation to be a little more favorable to business.
Well, we can only hope for that one, but in the meantime, we have to deal with it as it is. So how should U.S.-based companies prepare for, let's just pick on one part of it. How do you prepare for DORA's resilience testing requirements?
Yeah, that's a good one. You probably have in your business some frameworks that talk about this already on some level. So look at what existing mappings you have to frameworks. Make sure you're not already complying with it. That would probably be the first thing that I would suggest.
So like a classic gap analysis there.
Yep. And in the case where you have to move forward, you establish whatever those protocols are for the testing. You're going to be dealing with a third party. So go find a third party that knows what they're doing in this arena. There's going to be some that have some experience by now. So align with them so your expectations and their expectations are aligned in their protocols. It would be good to help establish what those initial protocols are with somebody who's done it before. You're going to be part of this process, whether you want to be or not. So it's not just like, hey, there's this third party out there, they're doing this testing, we get a report. This is more back and forth. So you've got to establish who the ownership is, clear their plate, make sure they have time to do it. And then I would say this is sort of the first step in a long journey if you're going to stay up to date with DORA. So start investing in the processes and tools that support it. That's important. Certainly the evidence collection and things like that are going to be pretty crucial to this. There's a continuous monitoring piece associated with it. And then just know that you got to keep all your documentation. That's kind of the big steps. The reality is practically as you're going through this, you're going to also start to probably strengthen your vulnerability management program. You're probably going to strengthen your notification program because these would be natural byproducts of that threat-led penetration test.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing I'd add into that list, Tom, is when you get the report from the red team, actually having a defined process of, so what do we do with this? Because I've seen red teams drop reports, final report that a company has paid for, and for the company to go, and who owns these assets? Like, what do we do about this? Like, the reason that DORA is requiring this level of resilience testing is to make changes. And so if you get a red team report and just go, okay, well, cool, we'll file that under the things we already knew were on fire and ignore it, I think that's a problem. And I say that for lower maturity organizations because I think this resilience testing in a lot of cases is going to just confirm what they already knew. And the temptation to go, yeah, well, we've got a plan to fix that in 6 months, I think that's no longer relevant at this point, with the risk of, if you get examined under DORA, I'm not sure if that's the language they're going to be using there, but if you're audited or if there's evidence that you knew that something was wrong, the risk of daily fines, I think, does become a real challenge and a potential threat to organizations.
Well, that should definitely be a risk that you talk about in your risk management approach, right? I mean, there's no easier way to get money than if the business is at risk, right? So if your initiative is to become more compliant with DORA and you can articulate the risk in terms of money, and DORA is going to be very helpful in doing that, you're going to have an easier time sort of getting the business's attention to the budget you need.
Yeah, and really this is, do you want to serve EU financial providers? Oh, good, cool. So this is a way of staying in the market. I think that positive phrasing, I'd probably go with, as opposed to talking about, hey, we could be fined a lot. I don't see that one as being nearly as positive.
Yeah,
but this is also taking, like, we're talking about this. It's still 2024, but this comes in pretty quick, right? So what steps should U.S. companies take to ensure compliance by the 2025 deadline?
Yeah, it's, I mean, just so we're clear, the enforcement is January 17th of 2025. So it's not, and we're recording this in late November. So the reality is it's coming very, very quickly. So, if you're just now engaging, you're going to have to jump gears pretty quick. You need to understand first if you have a business that DORA is applicable to. I would say if you're doing business in the EU, there's a high likelihood you're going to have to do something with DORA. The ICT sort of network, as it's defined by DORA, is going to reach you. You're going to do that same gap assessment around your controls, and then you're going to have to quickly start to strengthen those controls where you found the gaps. I can almost guarantee you're going to have to update your contracts with your third parties. So,
or they might be coming to you to update them already.
Yep. Oh, yeah. If you're a provider, you're going to get definite pressure to update contracts. You'll probably get something that looks like a DORA addendum. My advice to you is dig through that addendum with a fine-tooth comb and make sure there's not other sort of concessions being asked for in that same addendum that don't apply to DORA, because we have seen some of that. But you're gonna get that pressure on contracts. Yep. I would also say find a process that keeps you in tune with emerging changes to the legislation or emerging clarity, either from the audit side or the government side. So you start to get better definitions. We've talked a lot about that. That's really important. And then just document. Remember, with any legislative regulation, the more you can document, the better off you usually are around your stance for compliance. I wouldn't say that document in general. I'm talking about compliance. So you can have proof even where you aren't compliant. If you say, hey, I know I'm not compliant here, but these are the things we're on track to go complete, you're going to be in a better position than if it's found as a gap and you didn't have any documentation around it. So
not just on documentation. I also think you should update your reporting for incidents. Right?
Oh, 100%.
That's one where, like, DORA does have some specificity, and I think that having updates to your incident reporting mechanisms, I think that's going to be necessary, and that's going to be a partnership with legal to make that interpretation of what is your reporting obligation, who do you report it to, and how does this bin in with everything else that we have to report to for various domestic as well as international regulations that we have to comply with.
100%. Yeah, I would say kind of under that gap assessment, you're going to find a lot of controls where you have to get specific, where maybe right now you're pretty general. And certainly incident response is one of those things. Your red teaming approach is one of those things. So yeah, be prepared. It's not a small lift in my estimation.
Okay, and then the other thing we mentioned at the top, I want to go back to, I was talking about how DORA came out about the same time as NIS2. So how does DORA interact with other EU regulations like NIS2, and what does that mean for U.S. companies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So DORA is applicable to the financial sector. NIS2 is much broader in its application, but it has this sort of what's the language they use? Essential and important entities, I think, is what NIS2 applies to. So there's some definition around NIS2 that has to be clarified as well. But just know that there are many organizations out there that are likely going to have to be compliant with both because they're doing work with financial institutions, but they have customers in other sectors too. For instance, if you're in the energy sector, you're probably going to be a NIS2 compliant organization. And if you're doing work with a NIS2 compliant organization, you're going to have some of those same requirements pushed onto you as well.
But the net of it, though, is what you're saying is if you're in financial services, DORA is going to take precedence. Otherwise, you're probably going to pick up NIS2, and you might get DORA.
Yeah, and if you're an ICT, you might get both. That's right.
Yeah. Okay, and that's if you're a critical ICT, I think you have to do DORA as well as NIS2.
Yeah. Well, so here's the part that we should probably clarify is DORA as a regulation applies to the financial institution and their critical ICTs. But if you're an ICT doing work with a DORA entity, a financial institution, and you're not critical, you're still going to get requirements from DORA pushed to you. You just won't have that I have to be DORA compliant sort of moniker. It's a nuance. They're still going to push a lot of the same compliance requirements to you because they have that third party risk management requirement. So even if you're not on paper compliant with DORA or have a requirement to be compliant with DORA, you're still going to have to be compliant to do business with those organizations with a number of DORA items.
And that's going to come in through contracts, not necessarily through some external mandate.
You got it.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot about DORA. We got a little bit into NIS2 and other EU regs. I think also we should review the, I almost said beer because it sort of looks like a...
It looks like a beer.
Those things. Is it a Pilsner, Tom, that looks like this?
Well, yeah, Pilsners look like this, yeah.
Pilsners look like... I learned a thing. We've been doing this for 2 years. And
Clarity, a lager looks like this of any kind,
island
lager.
It's more of a smell now. Ugh, okay. Yeah.
That's actually, well, to me, the smell has settled. It's not nearly as boozy.
Yeah, it's more apple, definitely. Well, we'll see how it's gone, and you've already taken a sip. Well, why don't you go ahead and review it first, Tom, and then we'll see where I come in on this one.
Yeah, well, I can tell you I have probably 8 different alcoholic beverages in my refrigerator, my beer fridge, and not one of them is a cider. So I don't typically drink these. I've had a couple that are good, but they're not so good that I'm going to go buy them. This one, super high ABV, and I'm not going to lie when I tell you that I felt it a little bit as we were talking. So that 8.4% seems to be hitting. It's really boozy in the initial flavor, and it's more appley on the second go around. So I like that some of that booze flavor subsided. All that said, I'm never going to buy it, and I'm never going to stock it, so I'm probably going to give it a 3.
Ooh, wow. I think this may have been your lowest ever on the show. I'm going to give it one more try and see where I come in on a 10-point scale. Taste. Yeah, it's that lingering taste of like rotten apple, of spoiled fruit, of
fermented.
Yeah, and it's not fermented in a good way though. This just feels like something that's just off, like something that's rotten. This is not the worst thing we have drank on this show, nor is it the worst thing I have drank in my life. However, I am going to give this a 2. This is something I would not recommend. This is something that I would not stock, like you say. I would, if I was offered this, I would avoid it. So I'm just going to give it a straight up 2. So we've got a 3 from you, Tom, a 2 from me, and that's all for today. So if you think you know a beer I'd like, and good luck with that, or if you have a FedRAMP question or a question about another regulation, drop it in the comments below. And remember to like our LinkedIn and YouTube pages to hear live interviews with information security professionals. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.